May 28, 1953. 5 miles high on the greatest peak on the planet. In gale force winds, a small tent clings precariously to ice and rock. Inside are 2 men, defying gravity, breathing where there is too little oxygen to live, determined to go where no man has ever been. This is their story. The first 2 men to climb the world's highest mountain. Edmund Hillary is a beekeeper from New Zealand, and his partner is Tenzing, a local mountain man from the Sherpa tribe, with one driving ambition: to get to the summit.
I lie in the dark, listening to the wind. It must stop. It must stop, so that tomorrow we can go up. So many men have died on this mountain. I have been to Everest 7 times. It is enough. It must be this time. It must be now.
Soaring into the sky from the high Tibetan plateau, Everest is the most powerful eminence upon the face of the earth. Remote, forbidding, unimaginable. A towering rampart between Tibet and Nepal, China and India. It dominates the mightiest mountain range in the world, the Great Himalaya. The summit is just over 29,000 feet, a place where it was thought no man could live and breathe. No one dared imagine they might conquer the highest peak in the world. The British were the first to challenge Everest. In the 20s, they would set off wearing tweed suits, the proper attire of English gentlemen out for a stroll. And yet these mountaineers pushed themselves beyond the limits of human endurance. In 1924, a British major, Edward Norton, reached an astonishing 28,000 feet. The air was so thin, he couldn't draw another breath. He collapsed and had to be carried back to the camp. No one would get as high again for 28 years. 2 days later, George Mallory and Andrew Irvine set out for the summit. They were last filmed as no more than minute specks moving on the snow above this rock face. Days later, from base camp, the rest of the expedition spotted a cross laid out high on the mountain. It spelled out death. On the snowfield below, the expedition leaders laid out blankets. Abandon hope, return. Mallory and Irvine's bodies were never found. They were among the first of many to lose their lives on Everest. This is the gateway to Everest, the once remote Nepalese village of Namche Bazaar. In 1950, Nepal began granting permission to one foreign expedition a year. The British, who for half a century had regarded the mountain as their own, were now in a race to reach the summit. But in 1952, it was the Swiss who had the sole right to climb Everest. All the British could do was wait and pray. The head Sherpa for the 52 Swiss expedition was a local veteran mountaineer named Tenzing Norgay. At 37 years old, this would be his best attempt to realize his lifelong dream. 6 weeks into the expedition, Tenzing Norgay was paired with the Swiss climber Raymond Lambert, a great bear of a man, to try for the summit. In a final push for the top, they pitched a tent here, almost 5 miles up. The conditions were unbearable. With no sleeping bags and little food, Tenzing and Lambert were struggling simply to stay alive.
We spent that terrible night beating and rubbing each other, trying to keep warm and survive. That terrible Everest wind, just terrible.
Cold, hungry, and exhausted from their sleepless night, the next day, Tenzing and Lambert struggled for over 5 hours to climb the top ridge. They advanced only 650 feet. One false move would have hurled them down into Tibet. To go on would have been suicidal. Their frustration must have been as unbearable as the conditions. They were forced to turn back, just 800 feet below the summit.
We had given everything we know, all our strength, but it was not enough. We descended in silence, knowing it had been our last chance. Experiences like this bring men very close together. I was born under the snow peaks, only a day's march from Everest. As a child, I saw it many times, rising high in the sky over the tops of the nearer mountain. But it was not Everest. In my language, it is Chomolungma, mother goddess of the world. My mother said it meant, the mountain so high, no bird can fly over it. But what could I do? I had a dream.
Tenzing grew up here in Tami village in Nepal, surrounded by Himalayan peaks, though he was born across the border in Tibet. His mother was from the Sherpa tribe. In folklore, the Sherpas are said to have 3 lungs. They're so well adapted to living and working in the thin air of these high mountains.
In our house, my family was packed together, all the noise and stench and smoke from the cooking. But we were very happy. We did not know of any other way to live.
The Sherpas are followers of Buddha, and Tami Monastery dominates the life of the village. It was here that Tenzing's parents sent him to be educated.
But one day, I was brought to a great Lama who consulted the holy books. He said I was the reincarnation of a very rich man who had died in Khumbu, so my name must be Tenzing Norgay. It means the wealthy follower of religion.
But Tenzing knew he was destined to follow a different path.
In Solokhumbu, when I was growing up, I was told about strangers who wore funny clothes and who traveled from far countries to climb up peaks. I asked, had these people no mountains of their own to climb? They said no. I wanted to go to the mountains with them. So one day, without telling my mother or father, I ran away to Darjeeling.
Far to the east, Darjeeling in India was a magnet for Sherpas who came in search of work as porters. Tenzing first arrived in 1933 at age 19. Here at the Tea Planters Club, the British recruited Sherpas for their Everest expeditions. If Tenzing were to fulfill his dream of climbing Everest, he would have to begin here as a porter. 2 years passed before he was selected for the first of his 7 Everest expeditions. But Tenzing proved himself quickly, winning the coveted Tiger Medal, awarded to the Sherpas who carried the heaviest loads highest. Most Sherpas climbed only for the money. For Tenzing, this was more than just a job, and Everest much more than a mountain.
But whenever my father used to get a chance of climbing, he just used to leave us and go. Because he always wanted to climb Everest. That was his great dream in his life. He had a great desire to climb Everest.
Over the next 2 decades, Tenzing grew into a strong and intelligent climber with a new name, Tiger of the Snows. Now in the closed circle of elite high-altitude climbers, his fame spread further with the near success of the Swiss expedition. At the moment Tenzing and Lambert were struggling for the summit in 1952, 2 New Zealanders were exploring in the Everest region. Edmund Hillary and George Low were determined to join the next British Everest expedition, but now they feared the Swiss had beaten them to the top. They were coming down off a high pass near Everest when news reached them.
Rumour was the Swiss had put 7 on top. My heart sank to my boots. Then we heard how Lambert and Tenzing had turned back at 28,250 feet. Relief and admiration chased through my mind. But Everest was still unclimbed.
Edmund Hillary made his name as a vigorous and daring climber in the mountains of New Zealand. He only began to climb in his early 20s when war service took him to the Southern Alps. Here, one day, Hillary encountered 2 men who just summited Mount Cook.
Here were 2 chaps who were really getting some excitement out of life. I was filled with an immense sense of futility at the dull and mundane nature of my existence. Tomorrow I must climb something.
The next day, Hillary climbed for the first time.
I returned after the happiest day I'd ever spent. And now, after years spent on snowy peaks and ice glaciers, I still get the same simple thrill out of glimpsing a tiny patch of snow in a high mountain gully. And I feel the same need to climb towards it.
Hillary first climbed in the Himalayas in 1951. Several weeks into the long trek through Nepal to Everest, he came to the beautiful Tangbache Monastery and stood spellbound.
I looked in wonder at the view filling the head of the valley, the greatest wall in the world, with Everest behind.
A few weeks later, with his great boyhood hero, the veteran British mountaineer Eric Shipton, Hillary reached this high spot and saw, to his excitement, a possible new route up Everest.
Even as the same thought was simmering in my own mind, Shipton said, "There's a route there." From the floor of the Western Kum, it looked possible to climb the Lhotse Glacier, steep and crevassed though it appeared. And from there, a long and steep traverse led over to a saddle at 26,000 feet on the south side of the mountain, the South Col. From there, the ridge to the summit might be climbable. Certainly, it looked a difficult route, but a route it was.
Had they found the key to climbing Everest? Even if they had, they would be forced to wait 2 years to find out. So Hillary and fellow New Zealander George Low went exploring. Looking at the photo now wakens memories of one of the happiest times of his life.
George Lowe and I I would have said were real adventurers. I mean, we might not be climbing the biggest mountains and all the rest of it, but we did have a very strong sense of adventure. I can remember coming down the Barwon Valley. There'd been a very heavy snowfall, the first snowfall of the monsoon. All the crevasses were covered up, so we all roped together, and I always seemed to be the sucker who had to go down in the lead. But I had great confidence in George Lowe's quick reaction. I'd go down and I'd step on the lid of a crevasse and drop down, and George very quickly would pull back, and the Sherpas would pull back, and I would usually be hauled to the top. And I'd get out and plunge on down ahead, and down I'd go again, and once again, George, I mean, you could say he was saving my life every time, but we don't think of it in that terms. And we were a team. Someone had to go down first, and someone had to be second to make sure they didn't go to the bottom. And that's the way we worked. We were a damn good team, actually.
His strengths were tremendous dash, and he, had great determination. And the other thing was he enjoyed it. He found it enormous fun. Weaknesses, I wouldn't reckon that he had any.
Late in 1952, Tenzing Norgay returned home to Darjeeling from Everest, haunted by the failure of the Swiss expedition. Ill with malaria and bitterly disappointed, he lost 15 pounds. Then came news that the British wanted him for their 1953 expedition. He would have preferred to climb with the next Swiss attempt, but could he afford to wait? He sought advice from friends.
He said, well, I'm not going with the British. I'm saying, no. At that time, negotiation was going on. I'm thinking, if you miss this opportunity, and then if you knock your head against the wall, you won't get this chance again.
Oh yes, he wanted to go. Early in the morning, he used to go to Tiger Hill. He used to walk right up to Tiger Hill, carrying all the stones in his rucksack. And here the people used to say that, oh, he's gone mad. But that was a good practice for him. He knew that he really needed stamina.
Tenzing felt, this time if I go to Everest, either I will die or climb Everest. I will never return back without climbing Everest. So he wanted a promise from me that if I die there, we'll look to my family.
The near success of the Swiss on Everest threw British plans into turmoil. Here was the last chance for the British to be first on the summit. Ed Hillary's friend, Eric Shipton, was sacked as the expedition leader. And John Hunt, a military man, was summoned to the Royal Geographical Society.
It was a bombshell. I read with disbelief that Shipton had been replaced by a new leader, Colonel John Hunt. The papers said he was a distinguished soldier with a couple of Himalayan trips to his credit. My immediate reaction was, Everest without Shipton is unthinkable. Who wants an army man anyway? I seriously considered pulling out of the party.
But letters from both Hunt and Shipton changed his mind. In early March, he flew to meet up with John Hunt and his team. The expedition assembled in the Nepalese capital, Kathmandu. Here, Hillary met for the first time the man whose name would be forever remembered with his own, Tenzing Norgay. And here Tenzing first met Colonel Hunt and Charles Wiley, the only Briton with working knowledge of the Nepali language. As Sirdar, or head Sherpa, Tenzing would work closely with Wiley throughout the expedition.
I'd heard a lot about this famous Sherpa, so I was very keen to get to know him. He's a very charming fellow, and always with a good grin on his face, good sense of humour, obviously very intelligent. We knew that he was very much in favour of getting to the top, had the ambition to do so, unlike all the other Sherpas who were just porters, really. They would carry their loads and do exactly as they were told and do it very well. But they didn't actually see the point of going to the top of the mountain if you only had to come down immediately afterwards.
This would be the most ambitious expedition ever attempted. 500 porters carried rations and equipment up to the snow line at Tiangboche. Here, the lowland porters were paid off. From here on, only Sherpas could cope with the height and the cold. 6 weeks trekking and training through the Himalayan foothills, and finally base camp was pitched at 18,000 feet. The expedition was now poised to begin its assault on Everest. The first obstacle was formidable, the Khumbu icefall. It was Hillary's job to find a route through the menacing glacial debris and locate a site for Camp 3 above. This was to be the lifeline for the entire enterprise. This was possibly the most dangerous part, a trial and error climb through a jumble of massive ice blocks constantly on the move, where crevices would gape open without warning. Now all the climbers were jockeying for position, well aware John Hunt was monitoring their day-to-day performance, each anxious to be chosen for an attempt on the summit.
George Lowe and I really thought that we would be climbing together. John Hunt wouldn't permit this. We had the rather sneaking feeling that John didn't really want two New Zealanders to stand on top of Mount Everest. So I was really forced to look around for another companion. And as Tenzing was very fit and very strongly driven to climb, I just made friends with him and we did things together. And we became a very good team.
Edmund Hillary is a wonderful climber on snow and ice. He's like the British. He doesn't talk much, but he's a cheerful companion, always sharing whatever he has with the Sherpas. We must be a funny-looking pair. He's 6'3", me 7 inches shorter, but we're becoming a strong, confident team.
Just now I was foolishly careless and took a mighty leap in the air at the last crevasse, landing with some force on the far side. It was too much for the overhang. It split and descended into the crevasse with me on top. Next minute, the rope came tight and the block dropped away under me. Tenzing's reaction was very quick. He seems to regard it as rather a good joke.
Now steps had to be cut up the icefall, and the bridges secured for the Sherpas to lift 3 tons of tents, food and oxygen up to 21,000 feet. The ice moved. Avalanches were a constant threat, but the work went on. It took many days to establish Camp 3. The icefall had challenged every man in the party, and there was still another 8,000 feet to the summit. As soon as Camp 3 was stocked, an enormous load of food and oxygen cylinders had to be moved to the head of the Western Khum to Camp 4. Tenzing was full of a new sense of urgency as he organized a small tent city in the sky. Then John Hunt announced his choices for the summit attempt. Bourdillon and Evans were first, but Tenzing and Hillary would be next. As they prepared the equipment for the summit, Hunt was startled to discover Tenzing tying the Indian flag to his ice axe. They had no idea then that the flag would become a potent emblem of controversy which would engulf Tenzing at the end of the expedition. An imposing physical barrier now confronted the expedition, the Lhotse Face, towering over Camp 4. The plan was to establish a well-stocked camp up here at the South Col. But to get there, 3,000 feet of steep, treacherous ice had to be made safe for heavily laden Sherpas. Once again, steps needed to be cut, ropes fixed in place, this time at an altitude and in bitter cold that enfeebled mind and body. The immensely strong George Lowe, in charge of this work, found his body grinding to a halt. It's called anoxia, when the lungs and the brain are starved of oxygen.
Anoxia turns you into a slow zombie-like walker, and your actual movements and leg movements become jerky, and you sit down a lot. You pay a visit to old age. And at the age of 29, as I was, suddenly you become a halt and lame old man.
At Camp 4, Charles Wiley waited with his porters, preparing a colossal load to be carried higher still. Everybody knew from the Swiss that establishing a strong base at very high altitude was essential for the summit attempt.
We planned to put a really big quantity of stores on the South Col, and that meant a single journey by as many Sherpas as was needed to carry this 750 pounds of stores. That worked out at about 16 Sherpas, each carrying a load of something like 50 pounds or so.
Time was running out before the monsoon storms. They had lost many days cutting steps to reach the South Col. John Hunt sent Tenzing and Hillary to reinforce Wiley's efforts.
Hillary and Tenzing asked me how they could best help us, and I said, well, could you go ahead and remake the track, because the track by then had been obliterated by the snow we'd had during the night. And off they went very strongly, and we plodded behind, heavily laden, going very slowly. One of the Sherpas packed in, he just couldn't make it. So I took his load on, and for the next 500 feet or so up to the South Col, I was minus oxygen and with the load, so I knew what the Sherpas had been going through all that time. And they could only go a few steps at a time, and then one of them would whistle, and that was a signal for everybody to stop, and they'd all flop down in the snow until they were able to go on again. And I was like that. However, it was only 500 feet for me, and then we were there.
Several hundred feet below us is the South Col, icy, barren and windswept. Down there in a little lonely group are 3 small tents, their canvas bucking and thrashing in the wind.
At this altitude, the human body is getting less than 1/3 of the oxygen it needs to survive. They call it the death zone, this altitude where the body begins to die. Tom Bordillon and Charles Evans, the first summit team, left Camp 4 to climb the final 4,000 feet on the 26th of May. After a night at the South Col, they would climb the southeast ridge of Everest to the south summit. Their instructions were to carry on from there if they could. Dylan and Evans reached the south summit and took this picture. Here was a view of the top ridge that no climber had ever seen. But Evans' oxygen set stopped working. They'd reached their limit. From the South Col camp, they were spotted at the south summit, but they were coming down. Tenzing held a steaming mug of soup to their lips and wiped away the ice that encased their faces. These men had climbed for 11 hours. Evans said he didn't think the mountain was climbable. Snow began to blow. The South Col was an extreme of misery. Tenzing and Hillary, the expedition's last chance to reach the summit, were pinned down. May 28th dawned fair. Hillary and Tenzing set out after their three-man support team, but not directly for the summit. The plan was to set up one final high camp. If they could rest there overnight, they just might find the extra strength they needed to reach the top. Setting out from the South Col, they carried 50 pounds each, huge loads in such thin air. All inessentials were jettisoned. They climbed an ice slope, then a gully. Some way on, Tenzing steeled himself as he passed the shreds of the Swiss tent in which he and Raymond Lambert had fought hunger and freezing conditions exactly 1 year earlier. They hauled themselves onto the southeast ridge. Here, Lo, Gregory, and Angnima left oxygen and food for them and returned to the South Col. All afternoon, Hillary and Tenzing chipped and sliced at the unyielding ice to level a space to sleep. They took this photo in the early evening. The world lay below, with the great white ridge of Everest climbing over them into the sky.
Great gusts come out of nowhere. I doze and wake, doze and wake. Listen. There is no more wind, just the sound of our oxygen. God of my father and mother, be good to me today.
They set out at dawn to tackle the steep, deeply snowbound approach to the south summit.
It's 6:30. Already the sun is touching the upper part of the mountain. My 30-pound load is crushing me down. My body seems clumsy, unstable. Every breath is hurried, uneven. Up ahead, Tenzing is almost lying against the steep slope, but he's driving himself on.
It's almost vertical. The snow slides down with each step, and we slide with it. My hair is on end.
Every step was now a challenge. Every breath must be rationed as they struggled up 400 feet. But by 9 o'clock, they'd made it to the south summit. A little further along the ridge, Hillary took this photograph looking back. Ahead lay the vital route to the top.
It's a frightening sight. The ice reaches out over the east face, overhanging and treacherous, only waiting for a careless foot to break off and crash down 10,000 feet. On the left, the snow drops steeply to merge with enormous rock bluffs.
We take turns leading. One moves, the other plants his axe to anchor the rope. We are not so tired, but the oxygen is giving bother. Hillary clears the ice from the tube. I clear his. On we go.
One formidable barrier loomed, a great rock face that later would be known as the Hillary Step. Hillary and Tenzing stood below 40 feet of vertical wall. Here, all the years of planning and dreams could founder, so near to the top of the world. Their one hope was a man-sized crack between the rock edge and the snow.
I crawl inside the crack, taking a hold on the rock in front, and jam one of my crampons hard into the ice behind. My nerves are taut with suspense. Will it hold? Slowly, I'm forcing my way up, wriggling, jamming, using every little hold. I'm up the step. We're going to get to the top.
Tenzing followed Hillary up and over. For minutes they lay gasping. The ridge rose up in a series of snake-like undulations, bearing away to the right. They were desperately tired now. Hump followed hump. None of them to the summit. They had pushed themselves to the limit for 5 hours. Then suddenly, there it was. The summit of Everest, where Earth reaches out for the stars. The top of the world.
My heart is thumping with excitement and joy. The great open sky, and down there is Tibet. Ahead is just one hump, the last hump, the last. We are here. There is 6 foot of rope separating us. Hillary steps up, and I after him. The dream has come true.
I turn and look at Tenzing, holding my hand out for a good Anglo-Saxon handshake. It's not enough for Tenzing. Next thing, he throws his arms around my shoulders.
Now, in this moment, I feel love. All our companions are down there, waiting, watching, not knowing. Lambert seems so near. If I turn, I might find him there, grinning. Ça va bien, Tenzing? Ça va bien? Please, God, get us down off this mountain alive.
The descent was perilous. Drifting snow had covered their tracks. They were beyond exhaustion. Buffeted by violent gusts, they staggered down. A small figure appeared above the south col, coming to meet them. It was George Lowe with a flask of soup and a cylinder of oxygen. Next day, bone-weary, the party descended to Camp 4, where John Hunt had been scanning the heights for 2 days.
There have been many great moments, but I can't help feeling a touch of sadness that it's all over. Charles Evans and Tom Bourdillon, how vividly I recall them dragging themselves down the South Col, weary to death. John Hunt's lined, indomitable face as he wished me luck. That terrible loneliness as George Lowe and Alf Gregory left us high on our tiny ledge. Then, at last, Tenzing's smile of triumph on the summit.
The expedition left for Kathmandu unaware the news of their success could travel so far, so fast, or that it could so dramatically alter the course of their lives. Hillary was given a knighthood and was now Sir Edmund. But for Tenzing, the sheer joy of his great achievement would soon be overshadowed by conflict out of his control.
When we came out from the mountains and arrived in the Kathmandu Valley, he was immediately surrounded by a group of local people who were determined to indicate to the world that Tenzing had in actual fact reached the summit first. And he was completely befuddled. He didn't know which way to turn. They thrust a document in front of him which he probably had difficulty in reading, and finally in desperation he just signed it. And the document indicated that he said that he had reached the summit first. Well, he always regretted that.
They had no interest in Everest, just politics. Indian, Nepali, what difference does it make? What difference who stepped on top first? They would not stop, pushing and pulling me as though I were a toy.
Tenzing and Hillary were given a hero's welcome in Kathmandu, riding in the king's own coach.
There must have been about 100 triumphal arches all the way down, built of bamboo and papered over. But most of them depicted Tenzing at the top of the triumphal arch, waving the flag of Nepal. And if you look low down, you'd see a figure sprawled on the snow. And this was supposed to be Hillary below.
My father didn't know a word of politics. He was a mountaineer, very simple mountaineer. And that was his first experience, and he always said it was a bitter experience. It was very sad. After climbing Everest with the whole, team, parties, he expected a great joy, happiness, and prosperous. I feel that Lord Hunt and Hillary felt that my father was sort of trying to boss and show that he climbed Everest first, but which was not true.
The misunderstanding threatened to become an international incident and even jeopardized Tenzing's relationship with Hillary.
But later on, of course, when everything was solved, they had these statements from both sides, from my father and from Hillary, and they exchanged their statements.
After much deliberation, they signed statements saying, "We reached the summit almost together." Tenzing flew from Nepal to another hero's welcome in India. He met the great Indian Prime Minister Pandit Nehru. Afterwards, Nehru took him upstairs to his bedroom, opened his closet, and dressed him. But perhaps the gesture was not entirely innocent, for now Nehru was parading him not as Nepalese, but as Indian, indeed a hero of the new India, which had gained independence from Britain only 6 years before. From here on, Tenzing would always be troubled by the bickering over his nationality. Nehru established the Himalayan Mountaineering Institute, a climbing academy in Darjeeling, and gave Tenzing a post for life.
And then I still remember Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and the Chief Minister of West Bengal. And they had, of course, told my father, "Now Tenzing, now you make 1,000 Tenzings." And my father, of course, promised them that he would do it. And he did it.
Tenzing's hard work paid off. Within the decade, Indian expeditions had summited most of the great Himalayan peaks, including Everest. The mountains which had given Hillary and Tenzing their moment of triumph now brought tragedy. After Everest, Hillary was regarded as the leading figure in world exploration, but he was destined never to reach any more great summits. The next year, he was high on a neighboring peak when he broke 3 ribs rescuing one of his team, then developed pneumonia. Semi-conscious, he was stretchered off the mountain. A few years later, he suffered the first of 3 high-altitude strokes. He was only 42, but his climbing days were over. In 1975, tragedy struck Hillary again. His wife Louise and daughter Belinda were killed when their plane nosedived on takeoff from Kathmandu. High on Kunda Hill in the heart of the Sherpa homeland, friends built a shrine to Hillary's loved ones. Tenzing's first two wives had also died, and he took a third wife, Daku, younger than either of his two daughters. They had 4 more children, an expensive undertaking for a man without education, and all the burdens of fame on his shoulders.
Towards the end, he felt very lonely, and all his 4 children from third wife left him because they all went to America for their further educations. And I was the only daughter, you see, still living in Darjeeling, and I was always close to him. So every time I used to feel lonely, he used to call me, he used to send for me.
In the 1980s, Sir Edmund Hillary, now remarried, took on a new challenge in the subcontinent. The old adventurer became New Zealand's ambassador to India and Nepal. It brought the two climbing partners back together.
Yes, it's about, I think, 12 years since I was in Darjeeling.
Yeah, I think it's 12 years.
Yeah, so it's quite a while. Over the years, when I was High Commissioner in India for 4.5 years, I saw a great deal of Tenzing, and this was towards the end of his life. And we became very close friends. And he was a rather sad person. There was simply no question about it. You know, he'd seen the world, he'd travelled everywhere. He'd seen how the rest of the world lived.
Nehru had treated Tenzing as a son, promising him he would never want. But after the Prime Minister died, Tenzing found himself a national hero in need.
When it came to retirement age for Tenzing, he was receiving a pretty miserable pension according to our standards. And he resented this, there's no question.
Another thing is, he was getting old also, and he could not go to the mountain as often as he wanted. That was the, I think, depression he got. On the 9th of May, early in the morning, my father's servant came and said that my father is very ill, it's very serious. So I just got down, I went to see him, but I could not meet him. He had just passed away. That was the saddest thing in my life.
On May 14th, 1986, tens of thousands flocked to Darjeeling for the funeral of Tenzing Norgay. Once a poor Sherpa boy, then acclaimed as a hero the world over, and yet always a victim of the politics and controversies that plagued him to the end.
Tenzing's eldest son had the responsibility of setting light to his father's fire. And just at that moment, down came the rain. The rain was pouring down, but nobody cared. It was a combination of great sadness and a lot of joy. People were weeping and other people were laughing. They all knew he would return sometime, but they were celebrating also the death of a great hero.
Ed Hillary once wrote about Everest, "I had the world beneath my clumsy boots." Where once he strode the peaks, he now cautiously negotiates the valley paths. In his late 70s, he remains deeply committed to this Everest region, whose people aided his adventures, then rescued and nursed him when tragedy struck. Hillary and his old climbing partner George Lowe felt so indebted to their Sherpas that they asked them once if there was anything they needed. Yes, they said, help us build a school.
I always remember one of our Sirdars saying, our children have eyes, but they cannot see, which I thought was a pretty subtle statement in English for one of these so-called primitive mountain people. So I decided that I would organise the funds, and some members of my party and I would build a school in Kunjung, and we did.
Hillary's responsible for more than 20 schools and 4 hospitals in Solokhumbu.
I have now much pleasure in declaring the building open. In many ways, I've had my sadnesses, and I've had my pleasures and joys, same as everybody does, really. And I've had my successes and, I suppose, a few losses here and there. But I always feel that if you're completely satisfied with what you have done, I think you're kidding yourself a bit. I think there's always more that we could have done, challenges we could have met. And it makes life a lot more interesting if you feel that there was more you could have done. Now, as soon as you start being satisfied with your life, then you might as well forget it and go off and retire.
Generations of climbers from all over the world have passed this way with one common dream. This was once a remote valley in unknown mountains. Now yakloads of computers, video cameras, and satellite communications bring Everest into homes the world over. But for the Sherpas who live in its shadow, the prayer wheel spins, and lamas pray, because Everest remains indomitable, supreme, always to be feared and respected. Tenzing once said, "It is Everest that makes men great," looming like a guardian spirit, embodying man's hopes and dreams. To the Sherpas, it is, as it has always been, Chumalumma, Mother Goddess of the world.
presentation of the adventurers was made possible by the annual financial support of viewers like you.